On a cold Thursday morning in November of 2016, Walter Harlan walked out of the farmhouse he had owned for 42 years and locked the front door behind him. Across the yard, the porch swing moved in the wind. Inside that house were 3 empty bedrooms, 1 untouched sewing room, a kitchen table with 5 chairs, and a framed photograph of his late wife, Margaret, smiling beside a row of sunflowers. By noon, everyone in Gage County, Nebraska, had heard the rumor. Walter Harlan was broke. The farm was gone. The land was tied up by the bank. And the old man who had once owned 720 acres of corn ground was now living in a converted machine shed behind the north pasture. What nobody knew was that Walter had not lost a single acre. He was waiting to see who would come when there was nothing left to gain. Let me tell you about the Harlan farm, because you need to understand what Walter had built before you understand why he walked away from it. Walter Harlan was 74 years old. He owned 720 acres outside Beatrice, Nebraska, 2 grain bins, 1 equipment barn, and a checking account that had enough money in it to make most people sleep better at night. But Walter never looked wealthy. He wore the same tan coat for 16 winters. He drove a 1,998 Ford pickup with a cracked dashboard and a heater that worked only when the fan was on high. He kept baling twine in his pockets and cash in an old tobacco tin under the sink. He was not poor. He simply never learned how to act rich. Margaret had been the warm part of the farm. Walter planted. Margaret gathered. Walter paid the bills. Margaret remembered birthdays. Walter fixed fences. Margaret fixed feelings. For 50 years, that arrangement held the family together. They had 4 children. Grant came first. He was sharp, ambitious, and always looking for the fastest road out of town. He left for Lincoln at 18, earned a finance degree, and later became a regional manager for an agricultural lending company. Paula came second. She became a nurse in Omaha and built her life around schedules, efficiency, and saying she would visit when things slowed down. Ethan was third. He stayed close, but never steady. He worked construction, then roofing, then trucking, then nothing for a season, then something else again. And Ruth came last. Ruth was the quiet one. She married a school custodian named Daniel, taught 5th grade in Fairbury, and called her parents every Wednesday night at 7:30 for 22 years. Every child loved Margaret. That was easy. Margaret asked questions in a way that made people answer. She knew when Grant was angry before he admitted it. She knew Paula was exhausted before Paula said she was. She knew Ethan was in trouble before his truck turned into the driveway. She knew Ruth was lonely during her first year teaching, because Ruth's voice got too bright on the phone. Walter loved them too, but he loved like a field holds seed under the surface, silent, invisible until too late. Then Margaret got sick. It started with back pain in March. By May, the doctors had a name for it. Ovarian cancer, already spread farther than hope liked to travel. She fought for 11 months. The children came, but not the same way. Grant came twice, both times with phone calls scheduled around him. Paula came when her shifts allowed it and looked guilty every time she left. Ethan came when he needed money and stayed longer than usual, as if he knew he should be doing better but did not know how. Ruth came every weekend. She brought soup. She washed sheets. She sat beside Margaret's bed and read church bulletins, seed catalogs, and old letters because Margaret said she liked the sound of her voice. Margaret died on a Monday afternoon in February. Snow was falling outside the bedroom window. Walter held her hand until the hospice nurse touched his shoulder and told him it was time. After the funeral, the house changed. Not all at once. That was the cruel part. It changed in small, measurable ways. Grant started asking about estate planning. Paula started saying Walter needed to think about assisted living. Ethan asked whether Margaret's life insurance had come through. Ruth asked whether he had eaten dinner. At first, Walter told himself grief made people strange. By summer, he stopped making excuses. That's when Walter bought a black pocket notebook from the feed store. Let me tell you about that notebook, because it became the quiet witness in this story. It cost $2.79. It had a cardboard cover, 70 pages, and a red margin line down the left side. Walter bought it on a Tuesday morning, after Grant called to ask whether the farm ground had been appraised since corn prices dropped. Walter put the notebook in his shirt pocket and began writing. Not everything. Only facts. Grant called. Asked about appraisal. Did not ask about sleep. Paula texted. Said she was busy. Suggested medical alert necklace. Ethan stopped by. Borrowed $4,800. Left before supper. Ruth called. Asked if freezer had meat. Asked if furnace sounded right. Walter did not plan anything at first. He was not trying to punish anyone. He was trying to prove to himself that what he was seeing was not just grief making him bitter. Every Wednesday, Ruth called. Every month, Grant called if money was part of the conversation. Every few weeks, Paula sent messages full of concern but never picked a date to come. Ethan appeared when something broke in his life and disappeared when Walter fixed it with a check. By August, the notebook had become heavy in Walter's pocket. Not because it weighed much, because truth has weight once you write it down. One evening, Walter opened Margaret's cedar chest to find a quilt she had promised Ruth. Under the quilt, wrapped in tissue paper, he found a bundle of letters tied with blue ribbon. They were not love letters. They were Margaret's private notes, written over years, not meant for anyone unless she was gone. Walter sat on the bedroom floor and read until the light faded. One line stopped him cold. Walter thinks providing is the same as being present. The children know where his checkbook is. I am not sure they know where his heart is. He read it 3 times. Then he folded the letter, placed it back in the bundle, and sat in the dark house without turning on a lamp. The next morning, he drove into Beatrice and parked outside the office of a lawyer named Clara Madsen. Clara had handled land contracts for farmers in the county for 30 years. She knew every kind of family argument that could grow from an acre of dirt. Walter sat across from her desk and said, I want to know who would come if they believed I had nothing. Clara took off her glasses. That is a dangerous question. Walter nodded. I know. No family comes out of that kind of test unchanged. Walter looked down at his hands. They are already changed. I just want to know how much. Let me tell you about the plan because it was simple enough to fool people and cruel enough to make an honest man hesitate. Walter did not sell the farm. He moved the land, the accounts, and the grain contracts under a private trust Clara controlled. On paper, visible to outsiders, Walter looked like a man tangled in debt. His operating account was emptied. His tractors were moved to a neighbor's machine barn. The farmhouse was locked. The Ford pickup stayed because nobody would believe Walter Harlan gave up that truck. The old machine shed behind the north pasture became his home. It had been built in 1974. The same year, a tornado tore through part of the county and flattened the original hay barn. Walter and Margaret had once used the shed for seed bags, spare parts, and a deep freezer full of beef. In the back corner, there was a small room with paneling, a cot, a sink, and a propane wall heater. It was never meant to be lived in. That was why Walter chose it. On the first Monday of September, Walter called all 4 children. Grant answered from his office. Walter told him the farm had gone under, bad leases, poor grain sales, loans he had hidden. The bank was taking most of the ground. Grant went silent for 6 seconds. Then he said, Dad, how could you let it get that far without calling me? Walter wrote the sentence down. Paula answered between shifts. Walter told her the same story. She sounded shocked. She sounded sad. Then she asked, "Do you have a safe place to stay?" Walter said yes. She said, "Okay, keep me updated." The call lasted 5 minutes. Ethan answered with wind noise in the background. When Walter finished, Ethan said, "So there's nothing left? Nothing at all?" "No." "What about the money Mom had?" "Gone." Ethan swore under his breath. Then the line went dead. Ruth answered from her kitchen. Walter could hear water running and a child practicing spelling words in the background. He told her the same lie. She did not interrupt. When he finished, she asked one question. "Are you warm?" Walter closed his eyes. "I'm fine." "That is not what I asked." He looked around the shed, at the concrete floor, the old sink, the wall heater ticking as it cooled. "I'm warm enough. I'm coming Saturday." "You don't need to." "I know." That night, Walter opened the notebook and wrote the 4 first responses. Grant, how could you let it get that far? Paula, do you have a safe place? Ethan, nothing left? Ruth, are you warm? He stared at those 4 lines for a long time. Outside, the September wind moved through the dry corn leaves like paper being folded by invisible hands. By the second week, everyone in town had heard. That was the thing about rural counties. Bad news traveled faster than rain. At the grain elevator, men lowered their voices when Walter walked in. At church, women touched his arm with careful sympathy. At the diner, old friends bought his coffee and pretended not to. But the sharpest moment came at the county co-op on a Friday morning. Walter had stopped in for a bag of dog food, though he no longer had a dog. He only needed a reason to stand among people and see what poverty changed. Grant was there. He had driven down from Lincoln for a lender meeting and was standing near the counter with 2 men in pressed shirts. One of them, a young loan officer named Blake Sutter, looked at Walter's old coat, the dust on his boots, and the dog food bag under his arm. Then Blake said too loudly, "That's the danger of holding land too long. Some men think dirt loves them back." Grant heard it. Everyone heard it. Walter looked at his son. Grant did not laugh, but he did not correct the man either. He looked away. That was worse. The sentence spread. By noon, someone at the diner had repeated it. By Sunday, people had shortened it. Old dirt lover. That was what some of them called him. Walter didn't respond. He just paid for the dog food, carried it to the truck, and drove back to the machine shed. That evening, Ruth arrived with Daniel and their 2 children, Caleb and Annie. She brought groceries in 3 paper bags, a thermos of chili, clean towels, and a small rug for the concrete floor. She saw the dog food in the corner. "Dad, you don't have a dog." Walter looked at it. "I know." Ruth did not ask why he bought it. She only put the groceries away, washed the sink, swept the floor, and hung a towel over a nail beside the door. Daniel checked the heater. Caleb and Annie chased grasshoppers outside until the sun went low. Before Ruth left, she stood in the doorway and looked at the room. "This isn't a home yet," she said. Walter nodded. "No." She touched the towel on the nail. "It will be next week. Now, let me pause here and ask you something. What would you do if the person who raised you suddenly had nothing useful left to offer? Would you still drive the miles? Would you still bring food? Would you still sit in an ugly room with bad heat and no television just because that person should not be alone? Most people believe they would. Life often proves otherwise. Love is easy when it fits between appointments. It becomes clearer when it costs gasoline, time, sleep, money, pride, and convenience. Walter Harlan had spent his whole life measuring land in acres, corn in bushels, cattle in pounds, and debt in dollars. Now he was measuring something he had never known how to count. He was measuring who came back, and the only child arriving every Saturday was the one who never asked what was left. Grant came first. He arrived on a Wednesday afternoon in a black SUV that looked wrong on Walter's gravel lane. He stepped out wearing a wool coat and polished shoes, and for a moment Walter saw the boy who used to run barefoot through irrigation water. Then Grant looked at the machine shed. Not with grief. With evaluation. "You're really staying here?" "For now." Grant stepped inside. His eyes moved across the concrete floor, the cot, the metal shelves, the propane heater, the coffee cup on an overturned crate. This is not sustainable. Walter poured coffee from an old percolator. Grant did not take it. He talked for 40 minutes. Debt restructuring, liquidation options, possible sale of remaining parcels, tax consequences, reputation damage. He never asked whether Walter was sleeping. He never asked whether the heater worked. Before leaving, he said, "I need to see documents if I'm going to help." Walter said, "There are no documents to see." Grant frowned. "There are always documents." Walter wrote that down after the SUV disappeared. Paula called 4 days later. Her voice was soft, careful, professionally kind. She had spoken to a social worker at the hospital. There were programs. There were senior apartments. There were meal deliveries. There were transportation services. Walter listened. "Are you coming down?" he asked. The line went quiet. "I want to," Paula said. "I just need to figure out my schedule." Walter looked at the calendar Margaret had left on the wall. Paula had been figuring out her schedule for 7 months. "I understand. I really do care, Dad." "I know, but care through a phone line did not warm the shed." Ethan came in October. He arrived late, without calling, in a pickup with a cracked windshield and a temporary plate. He stood outside for a full minute before knocking. When he came in, his eyes were red. He did not ask about the room. He did not ask about the farm. He sat on the edge of the cot and rubbed his hands together. "Dad, did Mom have anything separate?" Walter looked at him. "Separate? Money, jewelry, bonds, anything not tied up in the farm?" "No." Ethan's face tightened. "I'm in trouble." Walter waited. Ethan told him about back payments on the truck, a credit card, a job that had ended, rent due in 9 days. Then he said the sentence Walter had been waiting for. "I thought there would be something." Walter felt no anger at first. Only sorrow. Ethan was not cruel. He was drowning. But drowning men will still pull on the nearest body. "There isn't," Walter said. Ethan nodded, stood, and left. He did not hug his father. He did not drink the coffee. He did not look back. That night, Walter wrote, Ethan asked about hidden money. Fear, not greed, still did not ask if I was all right. Then he sat with the notebook open until the heater clicked on and filled the shed with the smell of propane and dust. Let me tell you about Ruth's Saturdays, because that is where the real story lived. She came every week. Not when the weather was good. Not when it was convenient. Every week. When it rained, she came. When the gravel roads turned soft, she came. When Caleb had basketball practice and Annie had a school project due, she packed them in the car and came anyway. She brought what was needed before Walter admitted it was needed. The first Saturday, food. The second, curtains. The third, a lamp. The fourth, a second-hand recliner Daniel found at an estate sale and cleaned in their driveway. On the fifth Saturday, Ruth brought a box of Margaret's old kitchen things from the farmhouse. Not valuables, not antiques, small things. A wooden spoon, a chipped mixing bowl, a yellow dish towel, a tin of cinnamon. She placed them on the shelf beside the sink and said, "A room needs memory." Walter did not answer. He just looked at the wooden spoon. Margaret had used that spoon for dumplings, pie filling, gravy, pancake batter, and once to tap Walter's knuckles when he tried to steal cookie dough. That evening, after Ruth left, Walter held the spoon in both hands and cried for the first time since the funeral. Not loudly, not dramatically, just an old man standing in a shed, holding a piece of wood that had outlived the woman who made it matter. In November, the cold came hard. The machine shed held the chill in its concrete. The wall heater ran constantly. The wind found cracks Walter had not noticed in September. Daniel came with foam board, weather stripping, and a tool belt. He spent 6 hours sealing gaps. Walter tried to pay him. Daniel shook his head. "Margaret fed me every Sunday for 2 years when Ruth and I were first married. I'm still behind." Ruth cooked stew on a hot plate and made the children do homework at a folding table. The shed changed. Not much, but enough. A rug by the cot, curtains over the small window, a row of canned soup, children's drawings taped to the metal cabinet, a coffee mug with Ruth's school logo on it. Evidence of care gathered in corners. Meanwhile, Grant called twice. Both calls included the phrase, "remaining assets." Paula sent a care package from Omaha with vitamins, socks, and a printed brochure for senior housing. It was thoughtful. It was also mailed. Ethan vanished until Thanksgiving. Ruth came the Saturday before Thanksgiving with a turkey breast, potatoes, green beans, and one of Margaret's recipes written in Ruth's own handwriting because the original card was too fragile to carry. They ate at the folding table. Caleb complained that the shed smelled like tractor oil. Annie said she liked it because it felt like camping with a sink. Walter laughed. The sound surprised everyone, including Walter. Ruth looked at him, and her face softened. "There you are," she said. Walter looked down at his plate. "I didn't go anywhere." "Yes," Ruth said quietly. "You did." December arrived with ice. On the second Sunday of the month, Walter woke before dawn with a cough that felt too deep for his chest. He ignored it. Farmers are skilled at ignoring warning signs in their own bodies while noticing every warning sign in a field. By Wednesday, he had fever. By Friday, he could not walk from the cot to the sink without sitting down halfway. Ruth called at 7:30. She heard his voice and said, "I'm leaving now. It's dark. I know where the road is. It's just a cold." "Then I'll come watch you have a cold." She arrived at 10:15 with Daniel asleep in the passenger seat and the children bundled in blankets in the back. She took one look at Walter and drove him to the clinic. Bronchitis, nearly pneumonia. The doctor wanted him monitored. Walter refused the hospital. Ruth did not argue in the clinic. She waited until they reached the shed. Then she pointed at the cot and said, "Sit." Walter sat. For 4 nights, Ruth stayed. She called the school and arranged a substitute. Daniel drove the children back and forth. She woke every 4 hours to check his temperature. She made broth. She changed sheets. She listened to his breathing in the dark. On the second day, Grant called. He had heard from someone in town that Walter had been at the clinic. "How serious is it?" Grant asked. "Ruth is here," Walter said. "Good, that's good. I've got meetings this week, but keep me posted." Walter waited. Grant added, "Also, I spoke with a contact who might be interested in distressed acreage if anything becomes available." Walter closed his eyes. "I'm tired, Grant." "Right, of course. We'll talk later." Walter wrote it down when his hands stopped shaking. Paula called after Ruth texted the siblings. She sounded alarmed. She asked for medication names, diagnosis, follow-up instructions. She knew exactly what to ask. She was a good nurse. But when Ruth asked if she could come for one day to help, Paula said, "I'll try." She did not come. Ethan called once. He said, "Heard you got sick." Walter said, "I did. You okay now?" "Getting there." A pause. Then Ethan said, "Good." The call ended after 2 minutes. On the fourth night, Walter woke and saw Ruth asleep in the recliner, a blanket around her shoulders, one hand still holding the thermometer. The room was dim. The heater clicked softly. Outside, wind pressed against the metal siding. Walter whispered, "Margaret." She came. Ruth stirred but did not wake. Walter looked at his daughter and understood something that hurt. He had not raised Ruth to be the only one who cared. Margaret had. Let me tell you about the day Walter ended the lie, because that morning changed the Harlan family more than the lie itself. It happened on Saturday, the 8th of April, 2017. The fields were still brown, but the air had softened. Meadowlarks called from the fence posts. The frost had finally left the ground. Walter called Clara Madsen on a Monday and said, "It's time." Clara did not sound surprised. "I'll bring the papers." Then Walter called Ruth. "I need all 4 of you here Saturday morning." Ruth was quiet. "Do they know?" "No." "Are you sure?" "No." But he did it anyway. Ruth made the calls. Grant asked whether the meeting concerned land titles. Paula asked if Walter's health had worsened. Ethan asked if there was money involved. Ruth told each of them the same thing. "Dad wants you there at 10. On Saturday morning, Walter unlocked the farmhouse for the first time in 7 months. Dust floated in the sunlight. Margaret's curtains still hung over the kitchen window. Her calendar was still on February, the month she died. Her apron still hung on the hook beside the pantry. Walter stood in the kitchen and felt the house recognize him. Clara arrived at 8:30 with a leather briefcase. Daniel and Ruth arrived at 9. Ruth stopped at the doorway when she saw the house open. Her eyes went to Walter. "Dad, come in." She did. Grant arrived at 9, 47 inches, the black SUV. Paula arrived at 9:55, wearing scrubs under a winter coat because she had come straight from an overnight shift. Ethan arrived at 10, 8 inches, the cracked windshield pickup, unshaven, tired, and guarded. They gathered around the kitchen table where they had once eaten cereal before school, argued over chores, cried over report cards, and watched Margaret roll pie crusts on wax paper. Walter stood at the head of the table. Clara placed documents in front of him. Nobody sat at first. Finally, Ruth sat. Then Paula. Then Ethan. Grant remained standing with his arms crossed. Walter looked at his children. The farm was never gone. No one spoke. The land is still mine. The accounts are still funded. The grain contracts are active. The equipment is stored at Dale Krieger's barn. I moved everything into a trust, so it would look like I had lost it. Grant's face changed first. Confusion, then anger. You lied to us. Yes. Paula put a hand over her mouth. Ethan stared at the table. Ruth closed her eyes. Walter picked up the black notebook. I lied because after your mother died, I did not know whether any of you would come to see me if I had nothing left to give. Grant laughed once. It was not humor. It was disbelief with sharp edges. So you staged your own poverty? Walter nodded. You made us think you were ruined. Yes. You moved into a machine shed in winter to prove a point? Walter looked at him. No, to learn the truth. Grant stepped back from the counter. That is sick. Maybe. Walter opened the notebook. Grant, You came once. You discussed liquidation, taxes, remaining equity, distressed acreage, and documents. You never asked if the heater worked. You called 4 times. Every call included assets, land, or sale value. Grant's jaw tightened, because those were the practical issues. Walter turned a page. Paula, you called 7 times. You sent vitamins, socks, and brochures. You knew the medical questions. You did not visit until today. Paula looked down. Her eyes were wet. Walter turned another page. Ethan, you came twice. Once to ask about money Margaret might have left. Once after I was sick. You were afraid. I wrote that down. But you still did not come to sit with me unless trouble pushed you here. Ethan's face twisted. He looked like a man struck in a place he had already bruised. Walter closed the notebook. Ruth. The room changed. Ruth looked at the table. Walter did not need the notebook. Ruth came every Saturday. She brought food, curtains, medicine, a lamp, a rug, and your mother's wooden spoon. Daniel sealed the shed against the cold. Caleb and Annie drew pictures for the cabinet. When I got sick, Ruth slept in a chair for 4 nights. She missed work. She spent money she did not have. She never asked about land. She never asked about accounts. She asked if I was warm. Silence filled the kitchen. Outside, a truck passed on the road and faded away. Grant spoke first. You kept score. Walter nodded. I kept record. That's the same thing. No, Walter said. A score decides winners. A record remembers what happened. Ruth stood. Her chair scraped the floor. Dad, did you write down everything I did? Yes. Every grocery bag, every curtain, every time I came? Yes. Her voice shook. I wasn't performing for you. I know. Do you? Because it sounds like I was part of your experiment. Walter's face folded. For the first time that morning, he looked old. You were the reason I could end it. Ruth looked at him with tears in her eyes. I didn't want to pass a test. I wanted my father not to freeze. That sentence did what Grant's anger had not done. It broke Walter. He sat down slowly. The notebook lay between them. For a moment, nothing seemed to happen. Then Ethan began to cry. Not loudly. Not for pity. He put both hands over his face and bent forward like something inside him had finally lost its strength. I thought there'd be money, he said. I hated myself for it, but I did. I came here and looked around that shed, and all I could think was that I had counted on you dying with enough left to save me. Nobody moved. Ethan wiped his face with his sleeve. My life is a mess. That's not your fault, but I made you part of my rescue plan instead of my father. Paula began crying next. I kept telling myself I would visit next week, she said. There was always a shift, always a patient, always a reason. I know how to care for strangers better than I cared for you. Grant said nothing. Walter looked at him. Grant's anger was still there, but something behind it had begun to collapse. I was trying to protect the estate, Grant said. Ruth looked at him. No, Grant, you were trying to protect what you thought would be yours. Grant turned toward her. That's easy for you to say. You showed up every week, and now you're the saint. I'm not a saint, Ruth said. I'm tired. The words landed harder than shouting. I'm tired because Mom spent her whole life holding this family together, and when she died, everyone waited for someone else to become her. She looked at Walter. Including you. Walter lowered his head. Ruth continued. You gave us food, clothes, land, tuition, repairs, checks, trucks, and second chances. But Mom gave us language. She taught us how to call, how to ask, how to sit in silence. When she died, none of us knew how to talk to you. She looked at her siblings. And you didn't know how to talk to us. Walter touched the notebook. Your mother wrote something before she died. She said, I provided so much that I forgot to be present. Paula wiped her eyes. She was right, Walter said. Then he looked at Grant. I was proud of you when you left. I never said it. Grant's face tightened. Walter looked at Paula. I worried about you working nights. I never called because I thought you were too busy. Paula covered her mouth again. Walter looked at Ethan. I knew you were struggling long before you asked for money. I wrote checks because it was easier than asking what was broken. Ethan stared at him through red eyes. Walter looked at Ruth. And I let your mother teach you how to love while I stood behind her and called it family. No one spoke for a long time. Then Ruth walked around the table and put her hand on Walter's shoulder. She did not say it was all right. It was not all right, but she stayed. That mattered more. One by one, the others sat. Grant was last. He stood by the counter for nearly a full minute, fighting something nobody could see. Then he pulled out the chair across from Walter and sat down. The family did not heal in that moment. That would be too easy. But the pretending ended. And sometimes truth is not a cure. Sometimes truth is just the first clean cut before the wound can close. Let me tell you about what followed, because the numbers proved the lie, but the days after proved the family. Clara laid the documents on the table. Walter had not written a punishment into the will. That surprised them. The 720 acres would go into a family land trust. Ruth would serve as steward, not owner. Grant, Paula, Ethan, and Ruth would all receive equal financial shares from Walter's investments after his death. The grandchildren would inherit the land together. The farm could not be sold unless all 4 children agreed. Grant read that line twice. You're not cutting us out? Walter shook his head. No. Why not? Because punishment is not the same as repair. Ethan stared at the papers. I don't deserve equal. Walter said, this isn't about deserving. It's about belonging. Paula reached for a tissue. Ruth said nothing. She looked exhausted. Before they left, Walter made one request. First Sunday supper. Every month. No business unless necessary. No talking about inheritance at the table. Come if you want to. Do not come if you only want numbers. The first Sunday supper was in May. Ruth cooked because Ruth cooked when no one knew what else to do. Paula came early and helped peel potatoes. Ethan came with a store-bought pie and apologized for the crust before anyone tasted it. Grant came last. He stood on the porch for a long moment before knocking, as if he had forgotten that he had grown up inside. Walter opened the door. Grant held out a small cardboard box. Inside was a thermostat for the farmhouse furnace. The old one's inaccurate, he said. Walter looked at the box, then at his son. Come in. During supper, the conversation was careful. Nobody mentioned the notebook. Nobody mentioned the shed. Caleb spilled milk. Annie laughed too loudly. Ethan asked Daniel about a maintenance job at the school. Paula told a story about a patient who kept hiding pudding cups in his sock drawer. Grant said little, but after dinner, he stood beside Walter at the sink and dried dishes while Walter washed. They worked in silence. Plate, rinse, towel, stack. It was not an apology, but it was a beginning. By August, the first Sunday table had grown louder. By October, Paula came even when she had worked nights. By November, Ethan was helping Dale Krieger with harvest and had not asked Walter for money in 6 months. Grant began calling on Thursdays. At first, the calls were awkward. Weather, corn price, furnace, road work. Then one night, he said, Dad, do you remember my senior year when I wanted to quit basketball? Walter remembered. Grant had not known that. The calls got longer after that. Ruth still came most often, but she no longer came alone. That mattered. Walter moved back into the farmhouse in June. He carried only a few things from the machine shed: the rug, the lamp, the children's drawings, Margaret's wooden spoon, and the black notebook. He did not keep the notebook on the kitchen table. He put it in the cedar chest with Margaret's letters, not because he wanted to forget, because some records are meant to be kept, not worshipped. One evening in late fall, Walter stood on the porch while the fields lay dark beyond the yard line. The grain bins rose against the last blue of the sky. Inside the house, Ruth and Paula were laughing in the kitchen. Ethan was showing Caleb how to sharpen a pocket knife safely. Grant was talking to Daniel about replacing the porch steps, pretending he knew more about lumber than he did. Walter touched the wedding ring on the chain around his neck. "You were right," he said softly. The wind moved through the dry leaves near the porch. For the first time in nearly 2 years, the farmhouse did not feel like a museum. It felt like a place someone might come back to. Walter opened the door and stepped inside. The table was full again. This story draws from real rural family struggles, inheritance conflicts, and agricultural life in the American Great Plains. Characters and dialogue are dramatized for storytelling. But families like this existed in every farming county, families built